The Silicon Valley Bank collapses. This is the largest bank crash since the 2008 financial crisis. We're going to be discussing what caused it and how the government is stepping in to fix it. Former NFL player Michael Irvin is embattled in a lawsuit with the hotel chain Marriott after allegedly sexually harassing a female employee. And I interview Andrew Kaufman, an expert on the Russian author Tolstoy, and the author of a book called Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Tuesday, March 14th, 2023. I hope that you all are having a great week. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. You know, as I was saying that date, March 14th, 2023, I think that today marks 3 years exactly since the COVID lockdowns. Isn't that true, Sean? It seems that way. He's going, he seems like he doesn't know. Boy, I feel like these dates are seared into my memory. In fact, I think it was exactly 3 years ago today that I was sent home from Harvard. I remember that day very vividly. I actually had a midterm in my early modern Europe class. And we had heard some rumors that perhaps we were going to be sent home, or we actually thought, because it was about to be spring break, that spring break was going to be extended by a week or two in order to get COVID under control. And I remember walking into the classroom and the professor had chocolate for all of us. And she said, I don't know if you all have seen the email, but maybe you don't check your email before you take this midterm. And we had just gotten the email from President Larry Bacow that we had to pack up our bags and leave within 72 hours. Little did we know that we would not return for the rest of the year. That was my sophomore year. And not only that, but we would not return for another year and a half. I lost my entire junior year of college due to the COVID lockdowns. You know, I look back and there's a part of me, just a little part of me, that thinks maybe it wasn't worth it. Note my sarcasm. That was such a sick mistake and disaster that caused so many of us to lose the most precious time of our lives. I understand at the beginning, perhaps, sending us home when we didn't know what COVID was or what a threat that it posed. But certainly by the time that it was summer and they were making the decision whether or not to allow students to return to school, the fact that they kept us away for another year, and especially given that we were so young, I mean, ages 18 to 22, we are hardly at risk of contracting COVID and having really severe consequences as a result. It's really, again, a sick mistake. Moving on to news, though, I'd like to first acknowledge, before we get to the big news stories of the day, that there was a big deal that China brokered between the Iranians and the Saudis this past weekend. The Iranians and the Saudis have agreed to reopen embassies in each of their respective countries and to exchange ambassadors. This is a big deal. Because the Saudis and the Iranians were previously mortal enemies. The Saudis are Sunni, the Iranians are Shia, so that already creates a divide. They have been fighting a proxy war against one another in Yemen, where the Saudis have been supporting one side, the Iranians have been supporting another. The Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, previously said that the leader of Iran, quote, made Hitler look good. So it's a big deal that they are thawing relations, but even more than that, the bigger story here is that China is the one facilitating the deal between these two adversaries and not the United States. It appears that China is sort of stepping into our space on the world stage. That's just to say I want to acknowledge that this is a news story. I'm not going to cover it extensively today because I'd like to get on to this Silicon Valley Bank collapse. And also I have a great interview with Andrew Kaufman, who is a Tolstoy expert. So for the sake of time, I will be pushing that story for tomorrow, but I would like to at least put it onto your radar. The COVID dates. Sean is in my ear saying, do you want the COVID dates? Let's see if I was right. March 11th. WHO, the World Health Organization, declared it a pandemic on March 11th, okay? Okay, March 15th, CDC issued recommendations against gatherings. And March 16th, the lockdown started. I bet you March 14th, 3 years ago today, was the day that I was sent home. But again, I'm willing to be corrected. I'll come back to you tomorrow and let you know if I was right. So let's go on to this big story. This is the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. We have all seen this in the news. It happened last Friday, March 10th. It is the biggest bank collapse since the 2008 financial crisis. So I'd like to spend a little time today discussing what caused this, what is going on. You know, when financial news comes about, people's eyes tend to glaze over. And by the way, I don't blame them. It can be boring. And certainly the newspapers do not do a good job of explaining economics to those who are not already well versed in it. So today I would like to give you a background, again, give you a little bit of a synopsis of what caused this and what the government is doing to remedy it in simple, understandable terms. So for those of you who don't understand economics, please stick in here with me because it is geared towards you. The background here is that the Silicon Valley Bank is actually the 16th largest commercial bank in the United States. It was founded in 1983 and it has a big footprint among tech startups. So most of its clients are those who are engaged in tech startups. The Silicon Valley Bank has called itself, quote, the financial partner of the innovation economy. As I'll talk about in a few more minutes, they're very big into ESG, which is environmental, social governance, responsible investing. So it seems like this bank sort of wanted to be on the vanguard and in vogue with progressive ideas and seemingly successful companies in the innovation startup world. In addition to the fact that this is the biggest bank collapse since 2008, it's actually the second biggest bank collapse in United States history, second only to Washington Mutual, which roughly had about $300 billion in customer deposits. At the end of 2022, the Silicon Valley Bank had $212 billion in customer deposits. The Washington Mutual meltdown occurred during that 2008 financial crisis. So it gives you a sense of what a big deal this Silicon Valley Bank collapse is. So what caused this? It requires a bit of a background on how banks work and the way that they make money. So banks have depositors, which are all of us who go to the bank, give them our money and allow them to hold it for us. And what the banks do is they pay an interest rate, which is essentially a borrowing rate, to depositors to incentivize them to keep their money in that bank. And various banks compete to have higher interest rates that they pay to their depositors. So if you give $100 to Bank of America and Bank of America has a 5% interest rate, every year you will be getting $5 from the bank as payment for your deciding to hold your money in that bank. So Bank of America competes with JP Morgan Chase, it competes with Wells Fargo and other banks, which may set their interest rate at 6% or at 7%. Those seem a bit high, by the way. But it's just to say that they compete for interest rates that they pay their depositors so that their depositors will keep the money in the bank. The way that the banks themselves make money is that they take that money from their depositors and they make loans. Car loans, mortgages, other types of loans, and charge those individuals an interest rate that they pay the bank in order to get that loan. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be an interest rate spread, meaning that a bank wants the interest rates on loans to be higher than deposits so that they are making a profit. They want their people who they are lending money to be paying them more back in return than they are paying depositors to keep their money in the bank. So what happened with the Silicon Valley Bank is that they had too many depositors that they had to pay an interest rate or a fee to in order for those depositors to keep their money in the bank. And then their loans that they handed out to people were given at a fixed interest rate. So as we all know, because of this high inflationary economy, the Fed has been upping interest rates, which help cool inflation because, again, an interest rate is the rate at which you borrow. So when you raise interest rates, it makes it more expensive for people to borrow money because they have to pay a higher amount back to borrow the money. And if it's more expensive to borrow money, then people are not going to be as likely to do it. Then they're not going to be as likely to spend money. And that cools off economic activity and thus reduces inflation, which is, of course, high prices for goods. So with the Silicon Valley Bank, interest rates have been increasing because of inflation. So they have been taking in all of these depositors. In order to keep those depositors and compete with other banks, they pay those depositors a high interest rate. But then when they made loans a few years ago, they were making those loans at a fixed low interest rate when the economy was better. So they were probably making sure that the people who they were loaning money to were paying them a 2 or 3% interest rate, whereas they are paying their depositors more like a 5 or 6% interest rate. What they should have done, though a bank never wants to do this, you never want to turn away customers, what Silicon Valley Bank should have done is turned away some depositors and said, look, we would love to have your money, but we don't want it right now because we have too many depositors and we don't want to have to pay you these higher interest rates. So it led to this crash where the Silicon Valley Bank could not make enough money. There are other factors that people such as Vivek Ramaswamy, who wrote a great article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, an op-ed about this Silicon Valley Bank crash. There are other factors that people like Mr. Ramaswamy say also caused the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. In addition to having too many depositors and not making enough money from their loans, Mr. Ramaswamy says that they had too concentrated a client base of tech startups. And tech startups, of course, are volatile. Few of them succeed. So he says that they should have diversified the people who they were doing business with. And also, as I mentioned at the start of this segment, the Silicon Valley Bank, sadly, not unlike other banks today, are big into ESG, that is environmental social governance or responsible investing. They have a sustainable financial group that monitors progress for things like, quote, the operational climate group, which again is apparently a part of the Silicon Valley Bank. This operational climate group seeks to, quote, implement operational greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. And the problem with ESG is that when banks are so focused on being PC and acquiescing to the demands of the left, they don't invest in things that may be profitable. They invest in things that may fall into this category of being socially responsible, abiding by environmental social governance. But the whole point of the bank is that you have a responsibility to your depositors. You have a responsibility to your investors, if you're running a company, to make good investments, to make a profit for them. That is more important than following a woke ideology or, again, investing in certain companies that the left may cheer you on for. You have to make money for your clients. And it appears that among other factors, the Silicon Valley Bank was too focused on ESG and not enough focused on running their management well. So on Wednesday of last week, the Silicon Valley Bank announced that it had sold off $21 billion in liquid investments. That would be as if you sold off your car or your clothes or other belongings that you have in order to raise money. And they also announced that they borrowed $15 billion. They organized an emergency sale of their stock to raise cash, which caused the next day, Thursday, the Silicon Valley Bank stock price to fall by 60%. That is huge. And also in the wake of it, other banks' stocks started to fall. The First Republic Bank in California fell by 16.5%. The Signature Bank in New York by more than 12%. The Zions Bank Corporation by 11.4%. B of A and Wells Fargo stock dropped 6.2%, while JP Morgan Chase stock fell 5.4%. So you may be wondering, why did this happen? The Silicon Valley Bank is the one that failed. Why were other people going and perhaps pulling out some of their deposits, which caused these stock prices of other banks to fall? The reason is, and this is why, as I'm going to get to in the moment, the government bailed out the Silicon Valley Bank. There tends to be a ripple effect that when one bank fails, people in the economy start to get nervous that the bank that they hold their money in is going to fail. And what we saw with the Silicon Valley Bank is once that announcement happened Wednesday, when the bank announced that it was selling off all these investments, that it had borrowed $15 billion, all of the depositors of the Silicon Valley Bank immediately went and started withdrawing their money to put it into another bank. But the problem is, this is true of any bank, not just the Silicon Valley Bank. A bank at one time does not have enough liquidity. It does not have enough cash to be able to pay back each of their depositors should those depositors want their money and go to another bank. So when you look at your bank statement, let's say you have $25,000 in your bank account. It's a little tricky, but that amount is essentially an agreement between you and the bank that if you want to pull out your money, they are going to give you $25,000. But in reality, while you are still holding that money at the bank, they take some of that $25,000 and they use it to make loans, they use it to pay their employees. And so when you want to take out your $25,000, they dip into other people's deposits in order to pay you. It's sort of the way the bank works. There's a lot of sloshing of money around. So when a crisis like this happens, when a bank collapses, all of these depositors come, they want their money back. But again, a bank at one time doesn't have enough liquidity to pay back each of those depositors, which causes the bank to fail. And that's why we saw some other bank stocks fall, because people get really nervous and they also try to pull their deposits out of the bank for fear that those banks will fail as well. So what is happening now to rectify this problem? As I mentioned, the government is stepping in, specifically the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is the FDIC. They came in on Friday. They took over the Silicon Valley Bank and they declared it into a state of, quote, receivership, which is what happens when a bank needs to be taken over by the government. The FDIC has a legal obligation to insure deposits up to $250,000 in a bank. So if a bank fails and you are a depositor and you have up to $250,000 held in that bank, the government will guarantee every penny of that $250,000 back to you. The reason why the federal government does this is because A, banks pay a fee to belong to this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In case their bank fails, they want insurance that the government will insure at least some of their depositors' assets. But also, the government is doing this again to not create any panic. I like to use this analogy when referring to the way the economy works. I like to compare it to an airplane. So if you're on an airplane and there are 300 passengers and all 300 people really believe that the plane is not going to take off, it's not going to work properly. It doesn't matter if all 300 people on that plane, again, think that the plane won't take off. If the plane has the right equipment, the right pilots, the right fuel, that plane will take off, regardless of what the passengers think. The exact opposite is true of the economy. The economy depends on trust. You need to be able to trust your banks where you're holding money. You need to be able to trust that when you are buying or when you are paying someone, when someone is paying you, that money is legitimate and not counterfeit. You need to be able to trust that your investments are going to go well. An entire economy is knitted together through trust. So when a bank like Silicon Valley Bank fails, the federal government steps in because they don't want to create a crisis. They don't want to see all of these people around the country, again, pulling their assets out of the bank, not choosing to invest. It would be a disaster for the United States economy. So again, that is why the federal government steps in. So the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation legally insures deposits up to $250,000. The tricky thing here, though, is that with the Silicon Valley Bank, only 11% of depositors would fall into that category. So only 11% of the total people who put their money into that bank are guaranteed by the FDIC to be legally insured to get all of their money back, which seems like a problem, but President Biden has come out and said, as recently as yesterday, that they will guarantee, they meaning the government, the Treasury and the Fed, will guarantee that the money goes back to all depositors, not just those 11% who fall into the category of being legally insured by the FDIC. The Biden administration is affirming that everyone who made deposits into the Silicon Valley Bank will get back their money. This both seems wise and a bit unwise. Again, of course it seems wise because A, those depositors deserve their money back, and B, as I said, you don't want to create a panic. You want the federal government to step in and provide some help so that our entire economy doesn't collapse. But the reason why it may be unwise is that, as Mr. Ramaswamy argued in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, this may incentivize some irresponsible behavior. He said that the federal government bailing out the Silicon Valley Bank, quote, creates an incentive for risky behavior, teaching large depositors that they can throw money at risky banks without diversifying or conducting diligence. That certainly seems to be true. Also, President Biden said that all of those depositors will be paid back not through taxpayer money, but through charging the banks higher fees to be able to belong to that FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So in other words, our taxpayer dollars are not going to be going towards making sure that those depositors give back their money. That is a bit misleading because if you think about it, if you're going to charge banks higher fees in order to offset that cost of the government paying back each of the depositors of the Silicon Valley Bank, how are those banks going to fund paying those higher fees? They're going to dip into their deposits. That's all the rest of us. They're going to dip in to the money that people put in that bank to pay the higher fees that the Biden administration is requiring in order to bail out the Silicon Valley Bank. So it seems that the Biden administration doesn't want to explicitly say that this is a taxpayer bailout or that this is a government bailout, but really, in effect, it sort of is. Now, on to less intellectually tiring news, though I certainly hope that gave you some helpful background about the Silicon Valley Bank. Let's move on to this story about former Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Michael Irvin, who is embattled in a lawsuit with Marriott International Hotels. He is suing them for $100 million, he says, in damages and defamation after he was accused of sexually harassing one of the employees at a Phoenix Marriott. So let's go back to last month, February 5th specifically, and talk about what happened. We obviously don't know for sure what happened. The hotel lobby footage has not been released, But both Marriott and Michael Irvin's teams have respectively come out with their version of the story, and I will relay it to you now. So this occurred at the Renaissance Phoenix Downtown Marriott in Phoenix, Arizona. Mr. Irvin was there conducting Super Bowl week coverage. The Super Bowl was on February 12th, but he was a bit early because you know those men. They love the Super Bowl. They want to talk about it for weeks before. I don't really get it. Sean's smiling. I'm sure Dennis would be smiling too. And anyway, I don't understand. But he was there on February 5th for Super Bowl coverage. And apparently he was drunkenly coming on to a hotel employee. So the report that Marriott has says that Mr. Irvin was, quote, visibly intoxicated. He, quote, flagged down a female employee in the lobby. This is according to Dallas Morning News. Mr. Irvin asked what this woman did for work, told her that he found her attractive, shook her hand and introduced himself as Michael. And when she said that she didn't follow the NFL, again, this is according to Marriott, he directed her to search his name on the internet sometime. He then grabbed her arm and said something lewd. I am not going to repeat what that lewd remark was on this show. You can easily find it on the internet. The employee, the female employee, again, backed away. According to Marriott, Mr. Irvin then stepped forward and grabbed her again, came closer to her, when two female coworkers at this Marriott jumped in, saw that their colleague was uncomfortable and approached her. And as they got up to this incident with Mr. Irvin, apparently Mr. Irvin offered a parting handshake to the female that he was allegedly sexually harassing. The female shook his hand, and then apparently he said to her that he would, quote, find her later. The next day, the woman told her manager about what happened. She wrote a handwritten account of the event, and the two employees also wrote an account of what they witnessed. So Marriott then informed the NFL and ESPN of what had happened, and the NFL and ESPN immediately removed Mr. Irvin from Super Bowl week coverage, prompting him to file this $100 million lawsuit where he said that they interfered in his business relationships and he is suing them for defamation. Mr. Irvin has argued that Marriott never interviewed him about the incident or the three men who he is providing as witnesses. Apparently there were three men who outside the hotel Mr. Irvin had shaken hands with and taken selfies with, who allegedly witnessed the incident and are siding with Mr. Irvin, saying that it was nothing more than a handshake. There was no lewd remark or no grabbing the female employee. Mr. Irvin's legal team has also said that Marriott has not released the video. They are asking to see that video. During a press conference recently, Mr. Irvin teared up about the event. And let's listen to one of the things he had to say about what he thinks is really behind these allegations.
People every day walking in and out of a lobby. I couldn't even tell you what she looked like. I don't know. I don't even know who I'm talking about. When I'm talking about I'm supposed to do something. This just blows my mind that in 2023, we still dragging and hanging brothers by a tree.
Mr. Irvin also said, quote, "It sickens me, it sickens me. This takes me back to a time when a white woman would accuse a black man of something, and they would take a bunch of guys that were above the law, run in the barn, put a rope around his foot, and drag him through the mud and hang him by a tree." It seems to be quite dramatic for Mr. Irvin to compare this lawsuit to something as clearly savage, egregious, and morally abhorrent as lynching. This is just a classic example that we see of race hustling, where people are trying to equate present-day circumstances to the very legitimate evil wrongs of the past. Certainly, if Mr. Irvin is being falsely accused of sexual assault, he deserves to have his name cleared, and it is wrong that he is being accused of something that he did not do. But is that really something that we can compare to Jim Crow? What we need to start doing is calling individuals like Mr. Irvin out on this and say that you are actually undermining the gravity of what occurred under slavery and under Jim Crow by saying that your present circumstances are similar to that. But it appears that Mr. Ervin doesn't really care about honoring or appropriately dealing with the historical gravity surrounding those incidents. Instead, I think he just wants to use it for political and personal gain. And now on to a discussion of Tolstoy, that old bearded Russian author who you probably have heard of, who has written books such as War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Well, if you've wanted to read those books but never found the time or the energy, I have the guy for you. His name is Andrew Kaufman. He is a Russian literature scholar. He's the author of several books pertaining to Russian literature and especially pertaining to Tolstoy, such as Russian for Dummies, Understanding Tolstoy. He also wrote a book called The Gambler's Wife on Dostoevsky. And today we are going to be discussing his book called Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times. It's the perfect book to read, again, if you want to learn more about Tolstoy and specifically War and Peace. Hello, Andy. Thank you so much for coming on to Timeless.
Hello, Julie. Thank you for having me.
As I told you off the air, I loved your book. I am one of those people who has not yet mustered up the courage and the energy to read War and Peace, but your book inspired me to do so because it's very accessible for those of us who are not acquainted with Tolstoy, and I bet that it's all the more enriching for people who are quite acquainted with Tolstoy too.
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote the book. I sometimes describe it as a Cliff Notes on steroids, in the sense that everything you need to know for the cocktail party is in the book. But even beyond that, the deeper reason I wrote it is also to help, kind of bring this novel down to a very human level and help readers today appreciate how vitally relevant this book is to our own times.
Yes. It's a perfect segue. My first question was going to be to ask you how you got interested in Tolstoy. When did you start writing this book? I understand that it's your fourth book, or you've written some others about Tolstoy. But take me back to the Andrew Kaufman at Amherst College studying Russian literature. What motivated you to do this?
Well, actually, the story begins even before then. When I was in high school, Gorbachev had just come into power. I graduated in 1987. Gorbachev had been in power for 2 years, and my parents had the good sense to suggest that I start learning Russian language because Russia was going to be opening up, or was opening up as a society. And initially, my interest was some kind of foreign affairs, business, and that's why I started learning Russian in high school. But then when I got to college, I got to Amherst, and I discovered that I actually loved Russian culture and Russian literature. And that became my passion. And it started, I started taking classes in Russian literature. And I remember the War and Peace I was first introduced to. I was a sophomore. I think it was my freshman or sophomore year. I have to reread the book, but one of those two. It was the very first week of class, and the teacher had us read this imposing novel called War and Peace. And it was very bold of her to do that right at the beginning of the semester. But I was hooked for really a couple of reasons. One is, this was a time in my life where I was trying to figure it out. It was a very transitional period. I just moved from a small Midwestern town, and here I was thrown into a very sophisticated kind of East Coast culture. And I felt very out of place, very much like the character Pierre Bezukhov. And so in many ways, this book became kind of my companion on my own personal journey to understanding, who I wanted to be and what was important to me in life. And so that was, and then the other reason is I fell in love with this book is just, Tolstoy's capacity to describe reality in a way that's almost more real than reality itself, if that makes sense. He is known for that, his incredible, exceptional realism, his ability to portray life as it happens moment to moment with an accuracy that very, very few, if any other authors have.
Yes, you have this quote in your introduction that Tolstoy wrote when he was 27 in his diary. And I think it perfectly synopsizes what you just said about how Tolstoy writes about reality in a way that's more real than reality. He said, "The hero of my tale, whom I love with all the power of my soul, whom I have tried to portray in all its beauty, who has been, is, and will always be beautiful, is truth." I underlined, starred, highlighted that quote. I actually have come to see it as sort of my North Star, my guiding light. You know, certainly always I've placed a premium on truth, but in typical Tolstoy fashion, he just said it in such a beautiful way that resonated with me. So let's talk about the way that Tolstoy writes. You know, people, even for those who don't know a lot about War and Peace, probably at the very minimum, they know that it's a very long novel. It has hundreds of characters. It follows many different storylines: war, peace, marriages, breakups, sibling dynamics, rivalries. So this is probably a very difficult question to ask, but would you be willing to give a little bit of a synopsis of the story? Of course, you don't want to give away the ending, and there are so many, you know, characters and plots to follow, but how about we at least start with, where does War and Peace begin? What's the premise of the story?
So what is War and Peace about? The slightly snarky answer is it is about absolutely everything under the sun. If a human being has ever experienced it, felt it, struggled with it, seen it, sensed it, it is in War and Peace. But in terms of the actual plot, it is a historical novel which Tolstoy wrote in the 1860s, but he actually takes readers back to the early 1800s in this book, because the setting is Russia's wars with Napoleon from 1805 to 1812, and culminating ultimately in Napoleon's invasion, his failed invasion of Russia in 1812, and then it follows very quickly after that. It follows the years after that. So that is the setting for this book, the Napoleonic Wars, and the climax is really some of Tolstoy's greatest writing in all of his works is the climax of War and Peace, where he describes Napoleon's attempted and failed invasion in 1812. But the way Tolstoy keeps this very kind of grand canvas alive and personal for us is that he follows characters who belong to four key families: the Bezukhovs, the Balkonskys, Kuragins, and the Rostovs. These are four families, and he follows these families as they're going through this incredibly tumultuous time over this period of the Napoleonic Wars. And what he was very interested in is, you know, how life really happens. What are the forces that move history? What are the forces that move human beings at all times, but particularly in these really traumatic moments in human history? And he was also writing very much against a tradition at that time, which is sometimes referred to as the great man theory of history, which is the idea that history is defined by great men. In this case, everyone thought Napoleon was the great man, and ultimately he was defeated by Russia. So that theory, his greatness was he had a very rapid fall from grace. But Tolstoy shows that actually, no, it's not these great men who make history. It is all these hundreds and hundreds of characters and people, and these young children who are turning, you know, in their early 20s, and in some cases 12 and 13 when the book opens, and how they're growing up during this time and trying to figure it out and find their place in the world. And all of these different characters that history books never write about. And so Tolstoy wanted to write a different kind of history, celebrating what he thought were the real heroes of history and the real forces that make history move.
Well, the lack of simplicity of the book, to your point, is sort of the whole idea that history and certain events can't just be reduced to a few characters or a few storylines. And though there are probably times when you're reading the book where it's dizzying to track everyone, that's true of life. So let's talk a little bit, before we again dive into War and Peace, about Tolstoy himself, who we could spend the entire interview on. You do a marvelous job of talking both about War and Peace and then also weaving in these parts about Tolstoy and his life. And boy, what a character he was. There's a, I'm laughing about this because I was talking with my dear friend Dennis Prager about this book, and I said, Tolstoy is a wild ass of a man. In the Torah, I knew that he would get that reference because in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, God calls Abraham's son Ishmael a wild ass of a man. That really perfectly synopsizes Tolstoy. He was brilliant. He had a gambling addiction. He was a womanizer. You say he was racked with all of these, he was racked with self-doubt and frustration, and he also had these moments of creative bliss. So can you give me a little bit of a background on who Tolstoy was? Can you tell me a little bit more about his personality? And then the process of writing this book. You say that Tolstoy would write it and then hand it over to his wife, who would transcribe his illegible handwriting. And that's how slowly but surely over the process of years, War and Peace got written. So can you tell me more about all of that?
Yeah, so I love Wild Ass of a Man. I wish I had heard that before I wrote the book. I would have quoted that. Tolstoy was born in 1828 into a very a wealthy, very long-standing Russian aristocratic family. He lost both of his parents by the age of 12, 13, and so he had kind of a romantic longing, fantasy about who his forebears were, which is one of the reasons he wanted to write War and Peace, kind of understanding where he came from, where Russians came from. And he was a wild personality. He got kicked out of Kazan University when he was 19 or 20. He went there to study Oriental languages, and he thought, he let the teachers know that he thought he was smarter than they were, and they didn't appreciate that. And he didn't do his work, so he's kicked out. And then he spent much of his 20s, as a young gentleman, going back and forth between trying to start a school for peasants on his estate, serving as a soldier in the Russian army, in the Caucasus, in Crimea, the very place where all the trauma is happening right now. He was, as you mentioned, a womanizer. He had a gambling addiction at this time, and he was constantly in a state of spiritual crisis. And if you read his diaries from this period in his life, it's humorous, but almost tragically humorous writing from a young man who was constantly tormented with all sorts of angst and uncertainty. And he finally figured out that he had a talent for writing, among many other talents. And so he started to write in his 20s, but he really became known when he was in his 30s. Just after he got married is when he started War and Peace. He'd just gotten married in 1862, and he started War and Peace for real in 1863. It took him 6 years to write. And he was a young man. He was only in his 30s, if you can believe that. He produced this novel at such a young age. And you mentioned his wife. His wife was his everything, his helpmeet, his editor. She did, in fact, transcribe everything that he wrote. At the end of the day, his handwriting was so illegible, he couldn't even read it himself. So he would have his wife transcribe everything he wrote and leave it for him for the next morning when he would start writing again. This went on for 6 years, and she did that. And so, we need to thank Sonia Tolstaya, because if it weren't for her, we probably wouldn't have War and Peace. War and Peace was, and then in the next decade is when Tolstoy wrote Anna Karenina, and then he went through a major spiritual crisis, even by his standards, where he gave up writing and fiction. And he believed that all the time he had spent in the previous 20 years as a fiction writer was a waste. That his job on this earth is to spread moral ideas that will improve the moral level of civilization. So for many, many years, he became a religious prophet, a spiritual thinker, a political thinker. He was very actively he was very vocal on all sorts of contemporary events. In fact, Lenin called him the mirror of the Russian Revolution, in one sense, because Tolstoy was an anti-capitalist, even though he himself benefited from being wealthy. Another one of his contradictions. So, and he even wrote this work called the Kreutzer Sonata, where he was putting forth his idea that sex is evil both in and out of marriage. And this coming from a man who sired 13 children.
Yeah.
And so his entire life was a kind of a state of contradictions and a quest and various spiritual crises, the most pronounced of which happened after War and Peace. But what makes his writing so rich and so urgent is precisely that he was far from a perfect human being. And I like to say sometimes, if Tolstoy had been a perfect human being, his War and Peace would be a perfectly boring novel. What makes it so alive is that he brings all of his own torment and his angst and his searchings to these characters, and he gives a little bit of himself to all of the male characters and even the female characters in the book. So that's what makes him such a deeply relatable human writer. And people really, I teach Tolstoy in juvenile correctional centers and in prisons, and they really appreciate learning about Tolstoy because their image of this great Russian writer, as many people have, is that he was flawless. But they really appreciate to realize, wow, he was a deeply flawed man, and that it's okay to be flawed.
That was very moving in the book when you wrote about the reactions of those who you teach Tolstoy to in correctional facilities. Did Tolstoy serve in the Russian army?
He
Right.
did in
That's
his
right.
20s, and he later became a pacifist.
Another
He loved
contradiction.
another contradiction. He loved being a soldier in his 20s. He wanted to become. He was trying to become famous, and so that's one of the ways that young men at that time really made their mark in the military, by rising quickly through the ranks. And he had some success there, but he had openly admitted that if I had to choose between virtue and fame, I'm afraid I would choose fame. He wrote that when he was 20, I think 26. And so for him, the army was kind of part of that path to. But he was also very patriotic, and he believed in Russia, and he loved Russia. But he was not a nationalist. He was very patriotic. He loved his country, but he did not love his country at the exclusion of other countries. He did not believe that Russia was a superior nation. And it's that kind of chauvinism really came from Dostoevsky that we see playing out today in Russia. But Tolstoy represents a very different tradition in Russian thought, the tradition that I think Russians should pay more attention to today, rather than the Dostoevsky tradition. That's a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to make sure to mention that Tolstoy's relevance to this current situation.
Mm-hmm. I remember, I couldn't remember if he served in the army, though of course it makes sense, because how would he be able to describe the war part of War and Peace so accurately had he not served? And also, I do recall from your book, you said that there were certain Russians who were later on serving, in the army, who would read Tolstoy's book as they were in the fields, and they said that they were, I don't want to get your quote wrong, but it was something like they were more riveted by Tolstoy than they were by the battles that they themselves were fighting in.
So these were soldiers during World War II.
That's right.
Remember Hitler's invasion of Russia, history repeating itself. It was the siege of Leningrad, and Russia was on a war footing, and the government printed hundreds of thousands of copies of the climax of War and Peace, the famous Battle of Borodino, in the hopes of inspiring people with patriotic ideas. And the soldiers would often comment that the descriptions that Tolstoy has of war are actually more real than the very battles that they themselves participated in. And I think that gets back to this idea of Tolstoy's reality being more real than reality itself. As an artist, he had a capacity to show all the different dimensions of battle, and how it really happens and what's going on inside of people. And when you're participating in it, you're just experiencing it as an individual. But Tolstoy had the ability to step back and show everything that happens, the politics and the dysfunction and the desire, to live, and death and everything. And I think that's what those soldiers were referring to. So they were in the middle of of this war, and they were reading, they were riveted by the pages of War and Peace.
Mm-hmm. I want to tap more into this idea that you were talking about, that the soldiers are referring to, and that you and I have sort of referenced but not gone into throughout this interview, that Tolstoy's writing is sometimes more real than reality, to use your quote. I'd like to tell the listeners, though, that the way that Andy structures his book is by identifying some parts of life, or in some of your chapters, their virtues, and then going into how Tolstoy deals with those parts of life and those virtues. So there are 12 chapters. I'm just going to quickly read to you the names: plans, imagination, rupture, success, idealism, happiness, love, family, courage, death, perseverance, and of course, truth. I love the way that you structured that book, by the way. I think it's what made it so accessible to someone like me who is not fully acquainted with Tolstoy, because, these are all things that we encounter and deal with, and you did a great job of explaining how Tolstoy deals with them. My favorite chapter in your book was, I think it's chapter 3. It's called Rupture. And you talk about the one of the characters in War and Peace, Nikolai, who encounters some really troubling times, some really bad luck, and how Tolstoy identifies that during these moments of lowness, when you have just reached rock bottom in your life, you can actually tap into what you call a state of altered consciousness, a sort of weird state of momentary bliss that sort of allows you to see through the fog amidst your hardship, and that elevates you. And so you're talking about this emotional crisis that Nikolai, he taps into a reality, you say, larger than himself. He senses that there is something in life that is bigger than his own ups and downs, his narrow concepts of himself, or his familiar frameworks of understanding. And he specifically taps into this when he hears, is it his sister or his cousin, sing?
His sister.
His sister
His
sing.
sister, Natasha.
And you write, tumultuous times, Tolstoy tells us, can jar us into heightened awareness, expanding our sense of both ourselves and life's possibility. Losing something valuable, that is, we gain in return something invaluable, a radically widened perspective. You talk in the book, if I was going to say if you don't mind me sharing, but you wrote it in your book, so I suppose you don't mind sharing it at all, where your family encountered some financial difficulties, and it felt like the world had kind of opened from under you, and you also sort of found this state of momentary bliss. I know that in really, really hard times in my life, I have sort of, in a weird way, felt so grateful in those moments for my hardship, because I have felt like I've had an almost transcendent experience when I realize what really matters in life, and that there are things beyond myself. And I think, again, what's so brilliant about Tolstoy is we may not sometimes realize or be consciously aware of those more sort of finer tuned parts of reality in life, but Tolstoy just grabs them, pulls them out, and shows this is yet another nuance in reality of our lives. Anyway, I know I've been talking for a while. I just wanted to tell you that was my favorite chapter, and I hope it opens a discussion about these, again, sort of finer tuned nuances that Tolstoy so brilliantly identifies.
Oh, let me just follow up on what you said, because you basically very beautifully articulated why I wrote the book. And Rupture was, in fact, the very first chapter I wrote, even though it appears third in the book, because that was the chapter where I gained a new insight into this book. I had read War and Peace probably 15 times before that, at various times in my life, and it spoke to me in different ways depending on what I was going through at that time. Well, I was rereading it after 2008, after that period, that financial crisis that has since come to be known as the Great Recession. And it wasn't just me, even though in the book I talk about me, it was really our entire society was faced with this new reality and questions about capitalism and the excesses of capitalism, and what are the limits of capitalism, and people's lives were turned upside down. And so I was observing this, and it struck me at that time that, wow, this is what War and Peace is about. This is about a novel about a society of people going through a time of rupture, literally a war, and then being invaded by a French enemy. And so that was the glue that kind of tied these together. And I'd always sensed that when I'd read the book before, but it was crystal clear to me at that moment that was a new way of framing this book, and it never quite been framed that way. And I needed to write this book. I needed to Give War and Peace a chance to help readers appreciate that. As it turns out, troubled times are always with us. So they are timeless, to borrow the title of your
I didn't pay him to say
show.
that, but I'm very glad you did.
Troubled times, but so is the wisdom that Tolstoy offers about ways that we engage and deal with troubled times that can lead to fulfillment or can lead to destruction and self-destruction. So that is why I wrote the book.
It seems that Tolstoy strives to describe life as it really is, not how any of us may want it to be. And that's part of his brilliance. It also seems that he's sort of a translator or an explainer. Again, even in those moments of rupture, you may not sort of consciously realize that you may be having a heightened or altered state of consciousness, but Tolstoy picks out those parts of life that you may sort of glaze over and puts them right front and center in the book. What is another chapter that you would like to highlight for the listeners? Some nugget of wisdom from Tolstoy that you'd like to pass on. I told you my favorite chapter. What's another one that you think the viewers should know about?
How do I choose? Which of my children do I love the most? So I was asked the question, if you had to summarize in one sentence the core wisdom of War and Peace, what would that be? And you can imagine when I'm asked that question, I was initially like, what and how am I going to answer that? But actually, there's a quote from the novel, and there are two quotes from the novel, but this is the one that I would use right now to answer that question. General Kutuzov, or Tolstoy, writes at one point that there is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. There is no greatness where there is no simplicity, goodness, and truth. And for me, what that really gets at is, in our strivings in this world, our strivings to be successful and to find fulfillment, there are so many forces that we can't control. There are so many areas where we are not free, but we are free to choose our response to every situation and every moment. And some people choose a response that, like Napoleon or like Putin today, where for them what's most important is their ego and what they want to get, their agenda. But I think but Tolstoy's view is that the characters that ultimately thrive in this book and find fulfillment in spite of all the tumult that happens are the characters that realize that to be a great human being is to be a good human being, and to come from a place of honesty, authenticity, and compassion. And you would be surprised how difficult that is to realize that in the world. in the real world. And Tolstoy shows characters over and over again who diverge from that. The socialites, who are politicking and playing power politics, the politicians, but there are a handful of characters who really embody this wisdom, and one of them is the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, General Kutuzov, who is very different from Napoleon. In fact, Tolstoy juxtaposes these two figures: the giant egoist versus the humble leader. And it's no accident that Nelson Mandela, when he read War and Peace at Robben Island when he was incarcerated, he called it his favorite book. And he later said he learned a lot about leadership through Tolstoy's depiction of this General Kutuzov. There is no greatness where there is no goodness, simplicity, and truth.
There was also an American politician who you mentioned in the book. Was it William Jennings, Brian? Who, I thought this was so funny, who was supposed to go see the Tsar of Russia and then held off his meeting with the Tsar to go to Tolstoy's home. What was the home called? Starts with a P?
Yasnaya Polyana.
See, I don't even bother to say those Russian names because it's just going to come out so terribly. I love that quote. I remember it in your book. It's very powerful. What do you, again, this is one of those unanswerable questions. It's like when I asked you to synopsize War and Peace. What do you think it was about Tolstoy that made him a genius? Again, an unanswerable question. We'd like to know that of all geniuses, what makes them who they are. Do you think it was the culmination of his many different life experiences? Do you think it was the fact that he really did just have this drive to, as I said earlier, see life as it really is as opposed to how it ought to be? Do you think it was a little bit of his mania? Perhaps it was a cocktail with all of those ingredients that I just said in it, but what was it, do you think, about Tolstoy that really sort of put him into a category of his own?
Well, it's all of the above. You put it beautifully. It is a cocktail with all of those things. But as an artist, because remember, Tolstoy was a person, but he was also an artist. And the reason we know about him is not, the reason we know about his life is because of who he was as an artist. And I think the quality he had as an artist that is really what set him apart is he had a desperate passion for telling the truth. He hated lies in all of their forms, the big lies, the subtle lies, the little lies that we tell ourselves. He mercilessly dissects human beings and human nature and situations to get at what he thinks is a more accurate portrayal of who we are as human beings. And so he was writing against a tradition of European novel writing, and in Russia, especially romantic novel writing that he grew up with, a tradition that romanticizes life and idealizes life. And his goal as an artist, and the thing that he spent most of his time honing his craft for, was how can I tell the truth? How can I tell the truth of what really is happening in this moment? One of his first things he wrote when he was in his early 20s was called A History of Yesterday. A History of Yesterday. He rewrote the story of yesterday, and I think it was his own yesterday. And he goes moment by moment and trying to really articulate how difficult it is to tell the truth. And yet that was what and even the truth about what we experience. Our memories are always deceiving us, and our ability to capture the full truth of any moment is always eluding us as human beings. But Tolstoy strove to get as close to that as possible. And that is also very closely connected to that was a personal quality of his. Authenticity was something deeply important to him. He did not like people who were not truthful. And even if they didn't know they weren't being truthful, they weren't truthful to themselves, they were posturing. And so the characters that really leap off the page, like in War and Peace, is Natasha Rostova, who is living in the now every moment, even when it's not appropriate to do so. She is a force of nature, a force of life. And the reason we love her is because she is so vibrant and alive and authentic. And that for Tolstoy was a crucial human value that led him to need, as an artist, to tell the truth, as in a way that he believed no other writer before him had quite done.
He would have been good friends with Solzhenitsyn, who, of course, wrote the famous essay "Live Not by Lies." With Tolstoy, as I was saying earlier, he was a wild ass of a man. He had it seems like, through his gambling addiction, his womanizing, his sort of pendulum swinging of emotions, his serving in the army, his being a writer, his opening a school for peasant children. It seems like he was sort of addicted to life. It seems like he wanted to sort of get a taste or a sense of all of life, the good and the bad. And that's, I think, what probably led him to greatness, and would also led him down some paths that really were unfortunate for him. But what you're saying here about how much he loved the truth, detested falsehood, it just seems to me that he, again, wanted to get to the truth of all of life. And perhaps that's what spurred some of his escapades and adventures that some of us may scratch our heads at.
Yeah, I mean, and Henry James said War and Peace is the product of a monster harnessed to his great subject, all of human life. And so that's a quote from Henry James about War and Peace. A monster harnessed to his great subject, all of human life. Yes, Tolstoy was a extremely vital man, and he tasted everything, and he and often, to great detriment of him and his family. I mean, remember how he died. He ran away from home at the age of 82. Because he and his wife had been having disagreements in recent years about what he believed he should give away the copyrights to all of his works. And she said, and there were lots of fights about that in the house. And so he's trying to live in accordance at that time with his beliefs, his moral beliefs, but he was realizing he was always coming up short. And so finally, at the age of 82, he left his wife of 50 years a note thanking her for 50 years of marriage, but telling her that their differences are irreconcilable and he needs to go off and die alone. And that is how Tolstoy died. He ended up, dying at a train station at the very last minute. His wife was, just before he died, he saw his wife, and he reconciled with her. But yeah, his hunger for life led him in all sorts of exciting directions, but also some tragic directions. Yeah.
Because your book is titled Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times, what is one lesson that you think it would behoove Americans, or really anyone for that matter, but in our present day, why don't we narrow it to Americans today? What do you think is a lesson that would behoove Americans to learn from Tolstoy or from War and Peace?
Well, other than the quote that I mentioned before, there's no greatness where there's no simplicity, goodness, and truth. I think Tolstoy encourages all of us to find and follow our own path. There are many, many temptations to follow the path that someone else sets out for you, the path that society deems, the right path, the path that your family, tells you is the right path. I get college students sometimes come to my office, in tears, telling me that their parents want them to study economics because it's practical, but they want to study literature. And they're well-meaning. I mean, there's no judgment, but because the parents themselves have their own fears and their own hopes for their children. But there are so many forces which push us in various directions. And Tolstoy would say it is crucial, if we are to have a fulfilling, authentic life, that we keep asking ourselves, what is right for me? What will give me fulfillment? Even if other people don't understand it, what is the path that I am supposed to take in this world? And ultimately, if you sit with that question, meditate on it in solitude, you'd be surprised how close to the truth you will come to. The problem is we don't meditate in solitude. We're so influenced by all this noise and all these influences around us, especially today, that most of us don't even know how to connect with that inner self. And that, Tolstoy said, is what will guide you more than anything else to a life of fulfillment. It may not be happiness. It may not always be happiness, but it will be a life of fulfillment and meaning.
It is an excellent point, and you wouldn't believe, actually, I guess you would believe, how many of my peers at Harvard, and I don't mean to pick on Harvard, it's just, of course, the school that I just graduated from and the environment that I know the best, how many talented people would go into, would major in economics and then would go to these big firms and off to graduate school. And that's not really what they wanted to do. It's what they felt that they had to do. But actually, to your point, the problem, which is arguably worse than quote unquote selling out and going to those big financial institutions, is that they didn't know exactly what they wanted to do. They knew that it wasn't that, but they couldn't quite figure out what they really cared about and what they wanted. And unfortunately, we don't have very good examples today of adults, good role models, especially in those environments, who help encourage you to have that introspection and seek out a life that you want as opposed to a life that you think you ought to have.
It's hard. I mean, when I was in my 20s, Tolstoy, when he was in his 20s, he didn't know what he was put on this earth to do. But he pursued every possibility, good, bad, and everything in between, because he hungered for that knowledge. And it was only with time and with wisdom that that we often come to realize that. And I will tell you, I don't want to trash academia, but the problem with academic culture is that students are not encouraged, classes are not encouraged, are not set up to encourage this kind of deep reflection and self-reflection.
Yes.
They are encouraged, students are encouraged to learn certain disciplines and certain tools and analytical tools and learn certain content. But this idea of a college education as being a source of discovery about what matters to you in life is not the norm on college campuses. And so the kinds of ways that I write about literature, they may seem very obvious or irrelevant, but that is not how many professional scholars of literature think you're supposed to write about literature. But I can't imagine what else is an education for. Why else do we read books? And I don't fault people for that, because I understand that there are reasons that people, do the things that they do. And many people become professors, were themselves very much influenced by by their teachers and have various pressures. And so there's all sorts of reasons why people don't emphasize this reflection and self-reflection. But I think it's a huge loss, and it is responsible for a fair amount of the suffering and the dysfunction that we experience today in our politics, in our culture.
Yes, and also there used to be this understanding, I think, in American life that we were sort of past the baton of civilization, that it was our job to build upon what our forebears had built for us and to push our country and humanity forward. I'm not so sure we see it that way anymore. We really view it as our responsibilities to push ourselves and maybe our families forward, but not so much, there isn't so much of a sense of true introspection, but also introspection coupled with duty.
Well, in a sense of community.
Right.
And you're getting at something that is really central to War and Peace. In addition to the personal journeys of these characters, Tolstoy is also describing a time in Russian history where a nation came together in order to defend themselves against a common enemy, in this case, Napoleon. And so it was indeed a time of real unification of the various classes. And it didn't matter if you were a peasant or an aristocrat. It didn't matter what your background or where you came from. You had a common purpose in this world at that time in Russian history. And Tolstoy believed that that time was, in fact, a model of what it means to be, a good patriotic Russian, a good member of your community. And so I think that's what you're getting at. We talk about World War II as the greatest generation. Well, there was a very clear force, a very clear and present evil, which brought Americans together. Just as in War and Peace, there's a very clear and present evil. And absent that, we often manufacture evils, and we all manufacture different evils. And then the evils become one another and people who think differently from you. And or in the case of Putin, he's manufacturing an evil with this nonsense that Ukraine and the West are out to destroy him, or that Ukraine is always supposed to have been a part of Russia. He has to manufacture these because otherwise there is no unifying principle that ties Russians together today. And I would ask the same, think something similar about us. What are the principles? What are the values? And the purposes that bring us together as a nation.
I'd like to end on what you just brought up, the state of Russia today. What would Tolstoy think of Putin?
Oh, well, he wrote about Putin. Napoleon is Putin. So if you want to know what Tolstoy would think about Putin, just read War and Peace. The irony is that the French character, the French invader, is actually the character who most closely resembles Putin rather than any of the Russian characters. I think Tolstoy, in addition to just the horrors and the violence that we see, that he would be repulsed by, and he wrote very actively against, these things in his later years. I think beyond that, he would look at Putin as, the classic example of someone who is a total egoist and has not internalized the wisdom of there is no greatness where there is no goodness, simplicity, and truth. So he is as far from a genuine leader as, Tolstoy could have imagined.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And the next time I have you on the show and interview you, I will have read War and Peace. I am making this public promise so that I have to follow through on it. And I'd actually like to reread your book once I read War and Peace, because I think, as I said at the beginning, it will be all the more enrichment. Again, this is Andrew Kaufman. His book is Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times. Thank you so much again, Andy.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for joining us today. And remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you tomorrow. Take care.